I'd like to introduce John Kristoff, who will be moderating today's panel. John is a principal analyst at NetScout and a PhD at UIC. This is John's 17th time presenting at NANOG. John's first talk at NANOG was about botnets at NANOG 32 in Reston, Virginia, in the year 2004. John is also a valued member of the NANOG Program Committee. Welcome back to NANOG, John. We are certainly happy to have you with us today and introducing these fine panelists.
Thank you, Michael, for that kind introduction.
You're welcome.
I'll do just a brief rundown of who we have on stage here. I suspect most of you, at least in this room, probably know all these gentlemen. But for the benefit of those who may not, or for those at home attending for the first time, I'll just go from my end to the opposite end. To my right, to your left, is Doug Midori. Doug works for Kentic. He's, if you have the opportunity, if you could go ahead and put it on, if you look at the slide deck we had, look at his Twitter address. He has a really interesting Twitter feed that you should follow. Lots of good stuff about internet events and whatnot. He's really kind of our eye in the sky, so to speak, on the internet outages and anomalies. To his right, in the middle, on the opposite side, is Avi Friedman. It just so happens Avi works at the same organization. In fact, you all know Avi. He's hosting this event this time. He was the CEO for Kentic. But well, that was his main role, perhaps, he thought. He's actually here for a different reason, this NANOG. You'll find out briefly in a moment. To his right is Jared Mock, who many of you will certainly know, if not from where he's worked or where he works currently, which is Akamai. Previously at NTT, brief stint at Newstar. He runs the very well-known Puck Nether service. So you've probably joined a few of his mailing lists, have seen mail traffic from his systems pass through. He participates in a lot of ITF stuff these days as well. So I'll skip now right to the questions. I want to kind of go chronologically with one of the earliest events, perhaps the most famous of all the internet outages that all of us may have heard of or even seen the Wikipedia page of, is this thing known as AS7007 event. And I'm going to let Avi talk about this. And Avi, I want to ask you, if you would, just take a couple of minutes to tell those for the two people who've sort of wandered into the room who don't belong here, what that event was, what led up to it, what was sort of occurred, and the outcome of it, but why you in particular are a particular person of interest that we want you here to talk about that event. What was your personal involvement?
Wow. Are there any Leos in the audience of interest? Okay.
So pretend this is the hallway track.
Okay. So, we're talking about internet outages, and the internet in some ways is like the human body. The more you understand of it, the more amazed you are, not that it breaks, but that it ever worked in the first place. And some of the things that cause the internet to break are actually technological implementations to get around stupid human rules and policies. So, settlement and peering and things like that, and that factors into this AS7007 story. So, back in the 90s, a number of networks had a policy that said, if you are my customer, I won't peer with you. If you buy transit from me, you have no hope of getting transit from me. And that drove people to not want to buy from people they wanted to get peering from. And then some networks said, okay, if you've ever been a customer, we will never peer with you. And so a friend of mine, Vinny Bono, and I were sitting around in the DC area saying, aha, what if we get an AS to be a customer of this network that we would like to peer with, and then we will be a customer of it, because they only went one level of indirection, because if you go many levels of indirection, you sort of get the whole internet, so that doesn't work. So we decided to call it not the Florida Internet Exchange, the Fat Man, Little Man Internet Exchange, because Vinny is shorter than I am, and I was even more engineer-sized at the time. So we registered AS7007. Vinny bought a router, which sounds like a children's book. See Vinny buy a router. And so Avi said, please buy a Cisco. I may or may not say that now, but he wanted to buy a router that he thought was very advanced in its capabilities. It was one of the first that had some distribution inside of it, down to the line cards, and it was a Wellfleet router. Now, each line card on this router could run protocols and peer with each other. Like, isn't that really cool? Like, now we have Kubernetes clusters to do this, but at the time it was one of the first. Now, I wasn't a fan because it was sort of like writing a logo program to help someone support it because it was a GUI, and I wanted a CLI. But anyway, so he bought it. And then I didn't really think much of it. We set it up. We got transit. We both got transit from it. And then it was just a path on my network at NetAccess. Didn't think much of it until about a year later when one of my customers called me in a panic and said, Avi, I'm sending you a /17. Why are you re-advertising it to me as a /24? And who the hell is AS7007? And I was like, oh shit. So I called Vinny, who did not answer at the time, and I went on the internet. There was no Doug at the time, so we had iNet access mailing list, we had NANOG, and trying to figure out what was going on, looking at the routing table, looking at the instability. And it turns out from talking to Vinny, he actually posted to NANOG, I think, that he had, I was basically advising, don't continue to debug it, just like turn your router off. Except I missed something very important. What actually happened? I apologize. So what happened was BGP on one blade talking to Sprint 1239, BGP on another blade talking to his network, which I think at the time was MAI, RIP v1 in between. Now, RIP v1 is missing the ability to carry some very important things. And you might think AS path is the most important thing, but actually classful versus classless is the most important thing. And RIP v1, a /17, just becomes what's the first octet? Is it A, B, C? And so things got, that was the cause of the deaggregation, but also everything got re-advertised as 7007, which was on the blade, the AS running on the blade that talked to Sprint. So anyway, this happened, trying to debug it. Basically, eventually that router got shut down, but as sometimes happened at the time, back when the average router had the CPU of a 5-year-old Macintosh and memory, was the upstream had difficulty purging all the bad information. So I think it was about 6 or 8 hours later that everything finally, returned to normal, and various people were apologizing to various folks, and RIP v1 got turned off on the router, and that was sort of the story. But when one of your customers calls you and tells you that you're advertising their routes back in a way that you shouldn't be able to, it's definitely was not a fun moment. So in hindsight, it's fun and we laugh about it, but at the time it was.
Well, we waited almost 25 years for you to tell this.
Yes.
So, and we appreciate it. You did treat it just like a hallway truck with the explicitives and everything.
Yes, that's actually what happened. I was like, holy wow.
So let me ask you a follow-up question before we move on. In hindsight now, this has now occurred. I don't think we're going to find many people trying to do anything quite similar, especially with the RIP version 1 anymore. But what was the result of that outage? Did anything significant change, not just for you, obviously, in the network perhaps that you had built, or it supported other things that Vinny had decided on how to set this up? What the industry effect, what actually came about because of this? Has anything really changed? Could this happen again?
I mean, we suck and we're mostly lazy dumbasses until Manners happening recently. We've got massive problems with source address filtering that haven't really been universally addressed yet. It's something that we really should have been dealing with sooner. It's great what's going on with Manners. Path validation is up next, which is still a complex problem. So other than AS7007 being in some AS path access lists for a very long time, in theory to this day, as Patrick said, but other than, please don't buy it and use AS7007, I mean, there's still, I don't know the exact count. Kata probably knows, maybe Doug knows, and I haven't asked him, how many ASs could do this and are really unfiltered, maybe even not with max prefix. It's more than one and less than 10,000, and I really couldn't tell you. So I wish there was more of an impact. I don't know if anyone else, I mean, we could see if anyone else thinks there was an impact from it. Maybe I'm wrong.
We'll have some time at the end too, if other people want to contribute.
I mean, I know a lot of service providers don't filter quite as well or quite as much as they should.
Oh, you're a good guy. I trust you. You won't screw up. It's fine.
Yeah, and that's largely the way it, I think it is in many cases for the providers today, is that especially with everybody going these days for a cloud on-ramp type solution, so many people are going and connecting, to those places. I see there to be a lot of potential risk for those routes to get advertised out.
Oh, DDoS mitigation. Yeah, I need to be able to advertise anyone's stuff 24.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of opportunities for inadvertent mistakes, and being the types of engineers we are, and being human, bad things happen all the time. People forget, omit config pieces, and filters are missing, and there's always something.
Router configs that look a lot the same but are subtly different between different operating systems.
Yes.
Let me ask you now, Jared, slightly more recently, but still quite some time ago, almost 20 years ago now, there's this worm called Slammer/Sapphire. And for any of you who were around in those days, you probably remember this evening probably pretty distinctly if you were awake or on call. Tell us, if you would, just briefly, why was this a significant event, and perhaps what led to, I know in my own cases, some outages of this, and why? What was your specific involvement in this? Because again, here was someone who I think played a particularly important role, not in causing it, but in helping actually mitigate it. So please, if you would.
Yeah. So I call it the Slammer event, or the Microsoft. There's this software bug in the Microsoft SQL server that happened to actually be installed on many people's computers, because I believe it was in some SDK that basically ended up on a lot of different, in a lot of different applications. And so a lot of people didn't realize they were actually running an SQL server on their laptop or their machine if they had a certain application set. So what happened was somebody had figured out that there was this specific packet that you could send that was self-replicating. And they basically built in a scanner inside of this UDP packet that you could send on port 1434. And you could basically send it out to the whole internet. And what happened was, as each progressive machine got infected, it started to send pretty close to line rate UDP out to most of the address space. There was actually some bugs in it, so it wouldn't actually go and scan the full internet address space, which people later figured out how to improve on and fix once they reverse engineered it.
Must fix bugs.
Yes. Must fix this math bug in the scanner. But imagine. This was this was 2002 or 2003 time frame.
2003, I think.
Is what I recall. And so the high-speed internet connections that a lot of us have today, at our homes and such, that was the size of the big data center connections. The servers were connected primarily at 100 meg, and all of a sudden you have this 100 meg line rate, and a lot of people had, for their offices, they would have a T1 or maybe a DS3 or something if you had a very big connection. And all of a sudden now you've got a machine, multiple machines scanning you and filling up your internet connection inbound. If you have a couple T1s at your office or in your data center, which was pretty typical at the time, or if you were lucky enough to have a DS3 or OC3 or something, all of a sudden now you have all of that capacity being filled up, not only inbound but outbound on your network. So at the time I was working at NTT, and we had operated a very large network at that time, and we're a big aggregator for a lot of these connections. And you would have the proportional impact to the downstream customer was based on how much IP address space you had routed to you. And people would have like, a /16 or more routed out, these very small T1 links, T1 or DS3 links or something, and those would end up actually filling up. And that created some very interesting challenges in trying to mitigate it, because as I've had some debates with other friends of mine over the years, is your job to provide internet service? How much do you cling to things like the end-to-end principle? And how much do you need to like stop the bad thing from going on? And as a big service provider, you definitely don't want to be the internet's firewall. You want to be able to allow applications to pass through. But what we ended up doing is, I can't remember who was on call at the time, but we ended up implementing brand new filtering across the entire backbone, where we actually dropped.
Not rate limiting.
Not rate limiting. We did rate limiting for some future events, but we ended up just putting in hard filters on the routers based on the interface type. So we had these interface description codes. So it's like BB if it's a backbone to backbone link, or BC if it was backbone to customer, and BP if it was backbone to peer. And what we ended up starting off doing is putting filters on all the customer facing interfaces, and started to use the apply group. So we did, and I'm sure this still lives on today in the configs at that provider, is we actually did this matching based on the type code and implemented a way to basically roll out filters across all the customer interfaces to go and block the traffic. At least on all the Junipers, which we did quickly, and then we were able to roll that out to the Cisco's, later. But we actually went and we put filters in place to drop all UDP to 1434 to basically block the spread of this, and to limit the damage to the customers that were experiencing that at that time. And then I think there was a NANOG not long after where I remember talking about this as well.
One of the things I wanted to also see if you would address too is, along with what you did at NTT,
Yeah.
one of the key pieces of how all this sort of went down or got mitigated is that you didn't do this necessarily alone in a vacuum. There's folks like Chris Morrow and Barry Green and others. There was a community of people who sort of came together to communicate and deal with this. So say something about the community of people how did you actually do this, especially if there was links down you could maybe necessarily even communicate in some cases.
Yeah. So at the time there's been a variety of different communication things. So there was the NSP Security Forum, which was a mailing list that a lot of people joined that were able to go and mitigate and work on some of the security issues that were going on between all the different networks. It's a nice place to share that. There was also something from
What is Dial the AS?
Yeah, I was going to mention. So there was something that Packet Clearinghouse ran, which was something called INOC DBA, which was dialed by ASN. So you had these SIP phones that were sit on your desk, and you could actually dial like 2914 and then somebody's initials or something like that at the company, and you could actually call like by ASN and call somebody and say, oh, I need to get to somebody at NTT, and you could actually dial 2914 and actually end up there. Later, when I ended up actually running the phone system, I actually tied it into INOC DBA as well. So you could, if you were a customer and you had INOC DBA, you could actually do that and get into the NOC directly. Just direct, a direct call over the internet in case the phone system was down. Yeah. So, Patrick's here in the front row saying, assuming the internet is up. But I think what's interesting today is the internet is more largely up than some of these phone networks. Mm-hmm. When you start talking about the types of outages we see, that we've seen in more recent history. So it's definitely interesting to me how the tables have turned on that over time. But INOC DBA was a great way to collaborate with people at other carriers.
Just by show of hands in the audience, I know this exists some places. Who has UDP port 1434 filter still on the network? Anybody? I know some of you do because I've seen it. Two people there. Some of those filters still exist, I know.
I'm sure I remember it took us a couple of years to get them off all the customer interfaces. And then you would still find I believe there's probably still machines today spraying 1434. that are probably still infected. That would absolutely not surprise me, because these things seem to never die.
Now, last but not least, Doug, we'll aim this last one for you, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So yours is much more recent. One of the things that, and you're particularly good at this, in your Twitter feed even, is that we hear about very regularly, it seems these days, about internet shutdowns. Countries or governments actually doing something to disrupt or disable or turn off the internet somehow in their region. What is this? What's going on? Are routers literally being shut down? Are links being terminated? Are BGP sessions dropping? What's actually going on here?
Yeah, a variety of things.
And is this a new phenomenon?
Yeah, so I got introduced to this topic during the Arab Spring, so the shutdown in Egypt in January 2011. And I'm not going to go through that story. I think people generally know what took place there. And so I was fairly new to Renesas at the time, and so I was helping, just trying to figure out, what exactly took place. We saw all the BGP routes go down. That event, I've since argued, has kind of ushered us into our modern era of government suppressed communications and internet shutdowns that we're living in today. And there's a lot of legacy, I think, from that event. So there were other shutdowns in the Arab Spring with Libya, Bahrain, Syria, and then over the years it migrated to Africa, where there was a lot of contested elections in the following years, and now it's kind of just everywhere. And some of the legacies are there's now a lot of there's a big area in the digital rights space of organizations that either got more important or came into existence, like Access Now, NetBlocks, Internet Sans Frontiers. There are people who work full time now, documenting and advocating against these things. This is a profession of working against these events, and then on top of that, there's also a lot of public tools people have built. So out of CADA came the IOTA project. Cloudflare's got their Radar project. When I was with Oracle, we had an internet weather map, but also put out some internet connectivity stats so people could see for themselves that all the routes for a country were suddenly pulled, and they could hopefully the hope was the more light you were to shine on these things, they might shame governments into not doing it, and the results, I think, are kind of mixed. I'm not sure. It's still unclear. Like, so in this year, I won't take you through the last decade, but just in this year, so we had a contested election in Uganda where the government shut down the internet for a week, military coup in Myanmar, protests in Cuba, where there was a shutdown. Just in recent weeks, Bangladesh was down for a day because of violence against Hindi minority, and then I haven't been able to check. I've been traveling today. I don't know if Sudan is back up, but there was a military coup last week in Sudan, and the mobile internet has been deactivated. But you asked about methodology, and so in most of these places there isn't like a centralized kill switch where there's a technical means where someone can push a button and turns things off. And in fact, like in Myanmar, it was by fax. They were faxing around the orders. This is the military junta of, we expect you to turn. There was different phases in that one. This is when the mobile service was turned off. That was I had talked to somebody who was involved, and they said they got a fax and they basically had to follow the order. It takes, so Egypt was like a nuclear option. Everything goes down, fixed line, mobile, everything. And then there's some other variations where, like in Sudan, it's mostly mobile service, and that seems to be one way to be a bit more precise in your suppression of communications, because you may have the streets filled with protesters, and that's who you're trying to target. Whereas people in offices, and they don't want to cut themselves off, they want to cut off businesses. They just want to turn off service for the mass populace. And in most of these places, and maybe even in our country too, like most people mostly access the internet through a handset. So if you turn off, just disable, administratively disable the service via mobile, then you can knock out most people's access to the internet. And yeah, it's an ongoing human rights issue.
Can you see, or have you looked even at any long-term or longer-term effects of if there's some so-called shutdown? Does the traffic patterns from before and after change? Is there some reaction to these shutdowns where something about the
when it comes back up, does it look different?
Is the internet connectivity different in some way?
Boy.
Are people looking to find ways around it, that sort of thing?
I guess, let's see. I don't recall a time when it came back up, it was materially different. It doesn't come to mind. We also try to, this is both from we learned a lesson in Egypt that we kind of put a spotlight on one provider that was still up, and then government found them and turned them down, so turned them off. So we kind of thought about being a little bit selective when we saw remaining networks. Like there was an outage in Syria that you could see the academic network was still up, and we kept that to ourselves. We had a contact in the U.S. State Department during the Arab Spring, passed that to them. We did not go public. So we tried to be a little bit more circumspect about some of guarded about some of the information we would see. But and then in some of these outages in Africa, sometimes the government doesn't quite know its own internet layout, and so they'll turn off fixed line, but then a lot of these countries are still very reliant on satellite. We'll see the satellite pop up. Again, we keep that to ourselves. We may talk to some of these NGOs, let them know, because they're in the process of advocating, and they've got usually, like Access Now is, I've always had a good relationship with them. If I've got something technical, I know they're going to do the right thing with any information I provide, and then they have people in many countries trying to make sure people have some way to securely connect out, and so in some of these outages we've seen links stay up, and we don't draw attention to them, and we may let somebody know who could do something positive with that information.
When I've looked at some of this, and I don't look as much as Doug does, but definitely seen some of the application mix change, but it's a little fuzzier for us because to really see like this is Apple downloads versus Apple iTunes versus, or which Facebook, it's WhatsApp versus Facebook. We need DNS, and we don't have a huge customer base in these areas. But definitely seen, you can tell even by AS, you can tell, different application mix after, but we haven't really looked into it.
There's definitely also behavior. The people of these countries will react. So like Siphon's a very popular censorship circumvention tool. And so when there's an event like in Cuba this summer, Siphon will publish this big spike of all these downloads that they got. Like word got out, this is what you need to circumvent. And so that's one way people react to these things. But I made the argument in a Wired article this summer where, again, trying to look at what's the trend over 10 years since Egypt, that it may have been the case that all the advancement in circumvention tools like Siphon, all things like that, may like when they turn off Egypt, when everything was offline, that really negatively impacts the economy. The government itself needs the internet, so they need to be a little more. It seemed like that wasn't going to happen again initially, that it was going to be such a impactful outage that they would be a little more selective of what they shut down, or maybe just block certain social media. But people are pretty crafty these days. Maybe they weren't 10 years ago, but it's very common for people to have VPNs on their phones, if nothing else, just to be able to watch a soccer game that they're geo-fenced from. So people have this technology. It's pretty common now. And then and so if you don't, so that would enable them to get around any kind of censorship the government's doing. The only way to get to be completely sure that nobody's communicating is to just go back and turn it all off. And I think that's some of this may be a product. Some of these total shutdowns may be a product of the success and the innovation around censorship circumvention.
Well,
Yeah.
this is.
I was going to say, I remember one of the Myanmar, Burma outages was, when I was at NTT, we had a customer connection into that country. I remember during that, it was, the circuit was just down.
So this is like the 2008. That's like the
Oh,
real
yeah.
early pre-Egypt.
Yeah,
maybe the first real
one of the first
country.
big ones. It was just you
Someone
could tell.
took the Igor switch.
Somebody literally just you could tell they unplugged it because you went and you looked at the router interface and it was just down, loss of service, and it's like, because as you've mentioned, sometimes there's people in there who need to communicate for life-saving, life-threatening purposes and stuff, and it's important to check. So I remember looking at one point trying to figure out if there was, what the nature of the outage was, and definitely, people have gotten a lot more crafty in how they do this. There was the outage. What was it? I think it was in Turkey where they went and they took all the DNS servers and did stuff, and people ended up spray painting IP addresses.
Sure, like 8.8. There's lots of pictures of those.
There was graffiti saying like this is how to do it. DNS graffiti. That ended up being very famous.
It's all in education. People are getting smarter about how to use the internet by necessity.
I've only seen that outside Cloudflare's office.
Yeah.
Painted 1.1.
8.8.
Yeah, exactly. No, Matthew's not that chick.
Yeah. Then we get cleaned off.
Like, yeah.
So as you can see, just 4 people on stage can talk about war stories, I think, at nauseum. But what I'd like to do, if we could, and hopefully there'll be some willing participants in the audience, we're just over halfway through our time. I'd really like, not for these 2 gentlemen to do all the work. So I invite anyone to go up to the mic. You can ask them certainly questions about these particular outages. I tried to cover a security-related one, one of the kind of the old time, the BGP one, and then some more recent types of outages with Doug. But come up to the mic and you can ask them about any of those particular events. But what would, if you would like, and also opportunity for you, maybe take a couple of minutes to share with us your famous or notable or memorable outage. I invite you to do that. I know all of you probably have at least, 10 or 20
Especially
stories.
if you caused it.
Yeah.
Extra credit.
Well,
Anonymously.
if I can, I'd like to tell one of my favorite stories.
Yeah. So make your way up to the mic, but you go ahead, Jared, and tell the story. And if there's anyone online, hopefully Michael or somebody will read that to us at the mic as well.
So one of my favorite stories to tell was the time that I was on call and the router was stolen, which was definitely an experience. So what had happened was, I suddenly, I was on call and I got paged about this router being offline. And so, it was in some data center in some location. And, so I ended up talking with the NOC. I try and get in on the out-of-band console and it's not responding. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up, doing what you do. You dispatch a field tech out to go look at, the router and go figure out what's going on with it. Well, when the field tech shows up and we get him on the phone, he's basically like, hey, I'm here, I'm looking at it, but the chassis is here, but none of the line cards are there. So somebody had gotten into the data center and, in wherever this colo was, which, this was in the days when I think, colo was, wasn't as heavily secured as, as we'd like to think
Broom
it is.
closet. Dave.
Yeah, not quite broom closet, but they showed up and the router was, all the parts were missing except for the chassis. And what it turns out actually happened was earlier in the day the alarm had actually gone off at the data center, and nothing had happened. And then about 12 hours later the alarm went off again. And this time something had happened. And so the first time, the guy drove out, checked on everything, was like, everything's fine, and came back. And then it turns out, now the second time something was wrong. And then we had to actually go and scramble and get all the spare parts from all of our spare depots and work on replenishing, all of the missing parts from the router. So, which is, it's very important when you're doing that type of thing to have backup copies of all of your configs and everything. So we were able to, have the configs, pull those out of Rancid, get those onto the routers. But also, we didn't have enough of the right parts between the two different vendors. So I had to go and migrate some people from this, what was the Cisco routers over to the Juniper router at the time, and make sure we had all the right parts as well. And this was like, I think, channelized DS3 days. And so you had, the little micro BNC connectors versus the bigger BNC connectors. And thankfully, we were able to get it all going. But even some of the parts that we got from the spare depot were also failed. Or were bad, and so then we had to go and order again, and it made for a very long day, to eventually go and get the customers back online. But that's one of my my favorite little stories to tell, because how often are you on call and all the pieces of the router go?
There's no SNMP trap for router missing, router stolen.
Yeah.
Patrick?
Patrick Elmore, Deep Edged Realty. Question about AS7007. There's a rumor that has been persistent for a couple decades that the biggest problem was after Vinny literally unplugged the router, so there's no electricity, so clearly no announcements. The upstream Sprint was still running AGS Pluses at the time, which were old even then. And there was a special, which was not uncommon at the time for big big providers to get a special iOS rev just for them. So it was like Dashdorn or something, which did not accept withdrawals. Do you have any information on that?
I can neither confirm nor deny that because I really have no clue. But that would be so cosmically retarded to have an implementation that did not accept withdrawals that it's an implementation that did not accept notify. I've advocated for many times, but an implementation that does not accept withdrawals, I have trouble.
All right.
Even Rothbergianly, imagining that ticket being opened.
I've seen a lot of vendor bugs over the years.
Yes.
And, when in doubt, it's probably a bug as opposed to something explicitly implemented like that.
It could be. I just don't know.
Well, especially on those devices, you made the reference to the Mac CPU, but it was, it was a 5-year-old Mac CPU at that time.
Yes.
So it was the Motorola like 68030.
Yeah.
If you were lucky.
Yeah, is what was in that device, which,
4 gig or a gig, 1 gig or whatever.
Yeah.
They didn't have a gig.
Okay.
All right. So, Jared, on your Slammer thing, the biggest problem I saw and many people saw was that so many people had flow switching going. And there were so many different sources and destinations at the time that it just broke every flow cache on every router, everywhere.
The VXRs.
Everywhere.
The VXRs.
Yeah, the VXRs. That was fun. So did you have that problem in NTT, or once you were just dealing with full lines? You didn't do flow switching?
No, we didn't.
Ceph, the customer enragement feature.
No. Thankfully, we didn't have anything where, where that was the case. I mean, that was still when SOUP 2, MFSC2, I think was, quite common as well before SOUP 720. And so as long as you had your MLS configured correctly, just for MLS IP destination, then you were fine because that's all that was going into the hardware. And being in a service provider role, that's what we had.
So you got lucky. And finally, Doug, on yours, I noticed, and this is not terribly insightful, but I noticed that the biggest problem with, the biggest thing that is in common with all these countries that shut things down is that they have very simplistic internet topologies. I mean, if you tried to shut down the internet, quote unquote, in the United States or the UK or Japan or something, you couldn't do it, right? There's no list of every line. Okay, in that particular way, never
Without an EMP, an asterisk. Right?
Yes, never accept a challenge. Okay, but what's the chances, or when's the time frame? I don't know how to phrase the question. When places like Egypt are going to reach a point where the government can't just go in and pull 6 lines and suddenly the entire country has no internet?
I mean, I think, so years ago, Jim Cowie, who was one of the founders at Renesas, had written a blog saying, could it happen in your country? This was after the Arab Spring, and the topic was still on people's minds. And it just did a very back of the envelope kind of analysis of BGP level analysis. How many independent BGP paths are out of a country, like how many border ASs are there, and so then the idea was, the simpler the topology, especially if there's just one AS that provides service into the country, then it seems like it'd be really easy to turn that one off. If you have and so the argument would be if it's more complex, it's harder to do. But if the government knows the major providers and can fax or whatever, call and tell them to shut things down.
Kidnap the family members.
It's hard to overcome that. Now, one thing that's come up this year, especially with Cuba for some reason, was could we float in balloons and blast down internet service into a country, or there are some, there's a lot of new mega constellations of satellite services that are going up that are going to recreate all this low Earth orbit stuff that you'll be able to pull a signal from anywhere on the surface of the Earth out of the sky with a small piece of equipment. And could that make a difference? And now, technically, legally speaking, every one of those companies, just like any other telecom operator, needs to be licensed to legally provide service in the country. Now, at one point, Elon Musk this summer was, people were calling, we got to get, SpaceX has got to, blast internet into whatever country maybe it was Cuba. One other country was having the problem that day, and he's like, yeah, well, we're going to get on it. And then someone was like, well, what about someone in the industry was like, what about the legal things? Like, well, they can, shake their fists at the sky and yell, for all I care, was his response. So maybe somebody like that.
There's a joke there about self-driving networks. But.
So the short answer is a very, very long time.
Yeah, unless people, it requires equipment on the ground to make so that would have to get in to receive a connection into to a satellite. I don't know that topology makes a difference. In the United States, if the U.S., this has never happened, I don't think, but if the U.S. government gave an order of the major mobile operators in the U.S. to turn off mobile internet service for the whole country, it doesn't matter what the topology is. If this would go to court. It's hard to imagine that taking place in a country like this. But the topology, I guess my point is, it wouldn't matter if
we could use AmperNet, except they sold their IP addresses.
They could do which?
We could use AmperNet, except they sold their IP addresses. CB.
CV. I don't know.
Ham.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, not CB.
Anyway, yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman at the back.
Yeah. So
Please state your name and your organization.
Oh, my name is
I think
Rob
we're still
Robertson.
doing it.
I'm with Zayo. About 33 years ago, I started a new job at the University of California at Berkeley. I was a network programmer. Third day on the job, November 2nd, 1988, all of our systems went down. Flatline, rebooted them, brought them back up. They went back down again. Then it was the start of the Morse worm, which used a backdoor that Eric Malman had put in StenMail and a buffer overflow in the FingerD program and the ubiquitous R commands trusting each other to basically make mincemeat of all the Vaxes and the Suns and the internet. So that anniversary is tomorrow.
We should have done this.
And I
It also had bugs that were fixed later.
yeah.
Yes.
Let me, before you go, if you're not finished, I wanted to ask you a question about that, since there's probably relatively fewer number of us who were around in those days. I certainly wasn't. What was your feeling or reaction in those days? Because this was presumably long before people were so reliant on for commerce and whatnot. Was it like, oh, this is just fun or interesting, or were you mad? Were you shouting explicatives and getting calls from people? Like,
We were getting calls from people. One of the guy that left the back door in SendMill was actually in the building, Eric Allman. So there was kind of like, yeah, this is really important. This is terrible, but also he was a sort of a comrade. We didn't want anything to become of him. And there was a lot of people that aimed for what was his name?
Robert Morris.
Robert Morris Tappan Morris or something like to
Junior.
distinguish him from his dad. They called for his head. He actually went to jail. He was like the first one, at least internet-wide. So it was basically, we patched it back up and then went on our merry way. It took a couple of days for the entire internet to recover.
The users of my MUD were very upset that my big boy .cis.temple.edu kept crashing. So
MUD was an MMORPG back before.
multi-user dungeon game.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing that. I think the person right behind you, I think, was next, and then we'll come.
Hi, Chris Woodfield, Twitter. I'm curious about knock-on effects when there are major outages. Thinking specifically about the most recent large-scale outage of a provider, the fact that large network goes down to the point where it's withdrawing its prefixes is interesting enough.
That's
So
very meta.
they're down. But then what happens to the providers that are trying to reach that? For example, the flood of UDP 53 that your backbone router doesn't have a route for, so it had to send floods of ICMP reachables back. When you see those types of large scale outages, what do other networks see other than I can't send packets that way anymore?
And that might be a good question for Doug or
Yeah.
Jared. Were you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I've often seen, you end up seeing all of these interesting knock-on side effects from whatever it is. So you either see, this IP space is unreachable and stuff, but you can generally see it if you have your applications instrumented really well. So you may be able to see it in your DNS servers, be like, hey, I'm sending a lot more retries or retransmits for these things, or I'm getting a lot more serve fail answers or something like that. I think for me, that really speaks to how much before an outage, you need to have the baseline data available such that you understand during an outage what is actually going on. Because when your support lines, or when the phone starts to ring, which it still does, and you're trying to figure out what exactly is going on, you really need to have that key telemetry to understand where your baseline was before.
Part of your architecture.
Yeah, it has to be built in as part of your architecture. It's really critical because if you're trying to assemble it after the fact, you're like, is this a normal error rate? I don't know. Is this the right number of routes I should be receiving from this network? And you say recent outage, I can think of one that was very public and caught a lot of media attention, but there've been almost a dozen different backbones that have had issues since that large one in various different shapes over the past 3 weeks as well. And so I don't even know which one you're talking about. There've been so many.
The non-backbone. It wasn't a backbone.
Yeah. Well, if it was
Well,
not,
that's primarily a backbone.
yeah.
I think we can say Facebook,
But-
right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think that's what we're talking about.
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
surprised it took that long for us to come up in our in this panel, but yeah, so we've got
Very meta topic.
We've had F-bombs on this.
Yeah. Let's see. Yes. So on that one, people use Facebook as authentication to reach other sites. So then things completely unrelated, but save for authentication became inaccessible, and then competing. We had some different stats. There was somebody named Mark Tinkus put
We
up.
saw a UDP spike, didn't we?
We did see we saw the spike in port 53 from the retries that and this is Kentic data I'm talking about. We did see an uptick in some the competing social media, so Twitter. For us, when I looked, Netflix it was hard to see the difference. Some other people have said it has. There was, Mark, I think, wrote in the NANOG list that there was, you saw a 3 times spike in traffic to NANOG. I guess everybody, as soon as they can't get Facebook, fire up a movie, I guess.
I cannot confirm or deny that information.
Maybe. Beyond that, the DNS one kind of I think Damien from Google has in his talk a few nanogs ago made a comment about how people misinterpret DNS floods as a DDoS attack when it's really as an outage that there's all this DNS traffic that gets messed up as a result of all the unreachables coming back.
One AS to rule them all, and in the DNS bind them. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Chris. Warren, I think you're next.
Thanks. Warren Kamari, Google. So when 7007 happened, a bunch of people on NANOG kind of got bent out of shape, and there was some discussion. But recently, when like a social media site goes down, like everybody loses their mind, and there's mass drama, and the Congress gets involved, and all sorts of things like that. This means either, one, we can't have any more outages, or two, we need a better way of explaining to the public why this stuff is hard. Is there some way that we can explain that networks are now complex and it's not the same as what you have in your house?
And the
Or do
reaction
we just
to,
not have any outages?
I mean, 1997 was also a long time ago. The internet was still relatively new for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I think the question exists today. So I handle a lot of media inquiries about outages. So I think like in June, we had both, I think Fastly and Akamai both had, I think, pretty short-lived outages. And I was talking to a reporter from the New York Times, and they're like, how can this possibly be? And I was like, well, I don't look at it the other way. Like they were recovered in 50 minutes. I don't know. I was like, there's no error-free internet. Every network's going to make a mistake. It's just a matter of how fast can you get the thing back up. I was like, I would look at this as a success. Like,
Replace the general public with your boss, the CEO, the developer, the application people, the people that think that network is APIs and none of us exist, right? As Russ White, I don't know if it was his quoter, said, he said, automation does not mean simplicity, right? It may look simple, but underneath, it's still complex. So do we have a PR agency for the industry? Is that an analog function?
Well, and for me, the type of complexity that gets introduced into the network is generally all around the business logic as well. Is that, I can't send this traffic this way because of something. And so a lot of these things, the ultimate root of them is actually the business implications, and you need to evaluate the risk of whatever the technical change you're doing within the lens of that business risk as well, or the business optimization you're making. The whole reason for peering is largely not to say, hey, I have more peers than you, or to say I've got the most or whatever. It's largely about you're trying to optimize your business case such that your costs are lower and you're more competitive as a direct result.
Or control, but yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if we have a PR agency, but maybe outside of Doug's Twitter feed, the outages list, does that run on?
you're really pushing it.
Yeah, the outages list is maybe the closest thing we've got. And we've got, just so you know, we've got about 6 minutes. So if you roughly divide the time between the last two people at the mic.
Hi, Colin McIntosh, Netflix.
Even shorter than that, we have maybe an online question or two. So I'll take those after you.
Sure. A famous internet outage that I was not involved in, but always comes to mind was in 2001. There was a CSX train derailment in the Howard Street tunnel in Baltimore.
Yeah.
And as I remember the story, or as I was told, basically what happened was the train derailed and there was a fire in the tunnel for 6 days. And on one side of the tunnel was a fiber path, and on the other side of the tunnel was the diverse fiber path, which of course the fire melted both of them. I think we've seen a couple other situations where disasters have affected diversity and capacity on the internet, as that outage did. And I'm wondering if you think that now, 20 years on from that event, we're in a better place where major disasters, natural or not, will have an effect on internet capacity and diversity, or if you think we're in a better place now.
I think it's better, not perfect. We had cross-country stuff. We had buildings with what's in marketing we call collapsed sonnet, which means both sides of it run in the same conduit. But it seems like it's better overall.
Yeah, I would say largely outside of the subsea environment, it's largely better. Also, the customers are a lot more sophisticated in how they're buying the services. That doesn't mean that the carriers don't go and groom you or whatever, but aside from, there's the Sumatra quake, it was the day after Christmas or whatever that caused a lot of cable system outages in Asia, as well as there is the Tohoku quake, back that also triggered like Fukushima and some of the other events. And those impacted a lot of subsea cable systems. And those continue to remain some of the places where things are very vulnerable. I know we've faced outages from, recently, even this year on subsea, where because of COVID, the crews couldn't come into the country to pick up supplies to go back out to do repairs because they would have to quarantine, 14 days upon arrival into the countries just because they were coming from, the sea. So I think it depends. Like generally a land-based thing is going to be a lot easier to recover.
Let's see if Michael has a question for us from online. Statements.
Yes. Dan has a question here, or statement. He was working for some academic folks in India in the 1990s, and there was an outage for a week. And it turned out that people had stolen the copper lines going into the university. He then replies, they replaced the fiber or the copper, and it was stolen again. Brian has a question here where he asks, content application is critical. If I can stop the content application, I can make the system useless. Even though it is up, in quotes, how does the panel feel about the reference to government censorship and the Great Firewall of China?
It's a bit of a loaded question.
I just
Should it
read them.
be? Is it?
I don't know if we have enough time to really get into that one. We literally have like 2 minutes left.
It hasn't had an outage. I don't
Maybe
think.
future panel.
Yeah.
Future panel.
And then I have one last
They
statement.
can reach Facebook.
Read the last one.
The last statement is there's been some notable cascading DNS failures, like the Yahoo IM incident in 2001, caused by Yahoo blocking TCP 53 to the authoritative DNS service, and the massive one in China in 2009 related to the DDoS attack against an authoritative DNS server for a popular P2P file sharing application.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I think those are more statements than questions.
Yeah.
We have very briefly in the back.
Sure. Kevin Locke, QTS. Referring back to the major outage this year with the social media company, I think I read that was initially triggered by a in-house automation tool that had a bug in it. How concerned is the panel that there's a lot of automation increasingly deployed everywhere? Obviously, it's required at a certain scale. How much fragility you think might be baked in, bugs you won't discover until it matters the most?
Sounds like when you guys had the comment about automation and complexity.
Very concerned, much fragility, be careful, and test, please.
Yeah. I'm going to say, similar to what Avi said, is that it's still humans behind all of those applications, and coding stuff. And as creative as we may think we are, it's very complex for a human to think of all the different failure modes. But I do think at the exact same time, compared to where we were 20 plus years ago, back to the 7007 incident, the networks are far more resilient, converged so much faster, and the time to restoration, for many of these things tends to actually be relatively quick. There's the gentleman who got up and talked about, it took a couple days to recover from the Morris worm. I mean, we're talking about things where the outage duration is, measured in, hours for these major catastrophic incidents. And when there's, either subsea cable outages or something like that, you see the carriers all get together and actually do swaps on the systems that are up. But when it comes to automation, I mean, we've got a lot of stuff where, it's entirely possible that the systems may cause an outage, but at the same time, we continue to learn from our mistakes. And at least at my company, we've got a good culture of going in, reviewing the mistakes and trying to figure out, okay, how can we improve this and make this better every time?
One last statement I would make, the caution and this on that note is the thing I've observed is that a lot of people who write the automation stuff are not the people who truly have the big picture, like in the old days where it was one person who understood the network. There's a split often between the coders now, the DevOps people and the network people. Maybe, yeah. All right, with that, Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank the audience for your
for the
participation.
question.
I think we come to a conclusion, Michael. Sorry, if
no.
maybe a minute or two late.
Fine. If we can get a nice round of applause for these four gentlemen up here for this wonderful panel. Thank you, John, Avi, Jared, and Doug. Thank you again.